Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Violet Gateway. I'm John Vermillion. Today we have a very important topic to discuss, and we're going to be discussing, are you following your lineage or your soul? And this is a discussion between astral path versus what I call the soul path. And, I'll start this video out asking a pretty simple question, actually, so y'all can ponder on it, is what if the path that you inherited isn't the path you came here for? So when we think about that, we think about that we're born, we come into this world. Perhaps you're in a Christian family, well, you become a Christian. If you're in a Muslim family, well, you became a Muslim. Typically speaking, usually on the ancestor side of things, depending on your indigenous tradition, you typically follow that tradition. It's pretty common, it's pretty normal to do. Your culture has a particular spiritual identity to it. So you naturally are predisposed to assume that that must be your identity when it comes to your spiritual identity or your religious or spiritual practice. And sometimes it is, sometimes it is. But you find yourself, you follow the path, you learn the prayers, adopt the practices, you follow the system, you end up honoring the ancestors or the spirits attached to the system for whatever cosmology that it might come with. And then you become increasingly knowledgeable. This does happen. But what if you don't grow? What if you feel stuck and you're like, I can't, I don't feel like I can grow. Like I'm not growing anymore. Like I hit this roadblock. Like why? Is it my ancestors? Is it something I'm doing? And this is something a lot of people, think about. So, you might find yourself becoming more restricted, confused, disconnected, um, maybe feeling spiritually stagnant, like there's no movement within your life. Well, then it should really ask the question to yourself, is this actually your soul's path? Or is it simply the path that was kind of just handed to you and programmed with? And that's really, what we have to think because we're programmed from birth from pretty much all of our ideologies and belief systems. So it's important to think about and see where you might feel stagnant within that has been programmed into you. We must define what the ancestral path is kind of carefully. And, we have ancestral magic, when we have ancestral path. I would like to separate the two. And an ancestral path is more of that program thing, where ancestral magic goes a little bit deeper than that. So we have to define that, and we have to understand that an ancestral path is really a spiritual framework that either comes through lineage, culture, family, location where you live, the history, the general history of everything, and your overall traditions or the inherited traditions of the system. This can be anything from the religion, it could be ritual magic, um, beliefs in mythology, different languages, sacred languages, maybe specific family practices, because, you look at people like um, the Amish and stuff like that, they have very tight knit family practices that they keep, they hold it there. Your cultural spirituality overall, like you have, the Muslims, their cultural identity is pretty high. Um, Judaism, pretty high. And we also have to take in what is our inherited ideas of God and what is our inherited concepts of morality to the cosmology that we're dealing with. So we can't say that an ancestral path is not really automatically a lesser path. I mean, your ancestors have carried it throughout the generations and with profound wisdom. If you're a German Christian or a German witch or I come from a family of a German witch, and that's kind of part of the thing, right? We could say that is ancestral, but they have profound wisdom. They may have preserved these teachings specifically and handed them down to the future generations, usually through their oral tradition, which I've been trained in. My system's handed down to me orally. It's not just read in books. So these teachings, there can be an enormous power with ancestral connection when it comes to spirituality or religion. But just because you inherit it doesn't immediately mean that that's like your destiny, And just because it's in your blood doesn't mean that it's actually in your soul. We have to look at blood as like, yes, that is the life force flowing in, but what's that energy, that spark behind it? Well, that's the soul. And that's the big distinction here. So we have to come to understanding that your blood ancestry is actually not your soul ancestry at all. And people usually confuse ancestry with spiritual destiny. And, when you're familiar with something, it's easy to take it as spiritual truth. You heard it as a child, your family practiced it, culture reinforced it. You could be in a situation where everybody around you just believes it. That could be with anything. You just start believing what everybody's around you doing. But also, an ancestral style of systems, it's because it was lived. They died with it and they handed it down. So sometimes there's a push to be like, well, they did all that for us. Let's keep this tradition alive. So in our mind, we kind of conclude that, oh, this must be where I belong. And, you know, having that familiar resonance, oh, it feels good. But that does not mean that the familiar side of resonance isn't true resonance. It's not true resonance. So, for example, like when you're born into a Muslim Arab family, you're going to have that language, you're going to have the family, you're going to have the history upbringing, you're going to have the architecture, the holidays, the prayers, that overall identity of it. Same with a Christian family. It's no different. But really, neither birth circumstances really tell anything about the soul, to be honest with you. And the ancestral environment is really just that entrance starting point where everything's coming in and it's pulling that energy from the soul in. So it doesn't mean that your ancestry is actually your destination. The soul has a much larger history than, I would say, like your ancestral family tree. There might be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in your ancestry tree, but how many lives has your soul lived and how many people has your soul met and lived? It's, if we take on the idea of reincarnation, which I do believe in, even, in my belief system, I believe heavily in reincarnation. Um, multiple ones. You can just keep going, and it depends on growth, depends on what you want to do. And this is all, if we take that as a spiritual possibility, then, the concept of ancestry becomes much larger. It's not no longer blood, it's the soul, it's spirit. It's what you are beyond the physical body. So we could look at biology as like one ancestry line. You know what I mean? That's like one thing. Yes, we can say that, oh, this is your genetics, this is your culture, this is your predisposition. But the soul's history could potentially encompass so many more lifetimes, cultures, civilizations, different identities, different environments. So, if we've lived our lives more than once, well, what is that? you know and if we believe that we've lived more previous lives or we remembered them, the biological family tree, it only represents a small little chapter of a much bigger book. And there's, where we find different cultures, different religions, different languages, civilizations, etc. And realistically, this is where we can tap into like non-earth based experiences or different planetary incarnations, such as like ET incarnations, different forms. If you were incarnate in the Pleiades at one point, well, maybe things were a little different then. Might be very similar to something like Christianity or even Islam, maybe. But there might still not be a resonance. There's a soul resonance behind the ancestral resonance. So we can look at it like, who gave the current body its lineage? This. What gave the soul its lineage? What gave that soul that purpose? And then what experiences have kind of shaped that consciousness that is living through our body? These things overlap like two circles forming inside like a Vesica Pisces. And here we are in the center of that Vesica Pisces. They're not identical. At least they don't have to be. Your ancestral path and your soul path does not have to be identical all the time, because sometimes it can be completely different. I've met many people born and raised Christian their whole life, and then they turn to Hinduism. I've met, very deep, dark, satanic occultists that were like, you know what, I'm a Christian now. Okay, wonderful. That didn't take away the knowledge, though. It didn't take away their knowledge, their esoteric knowledge of everything, which is really great. So it doesn't always have to be identical. We find that ancestral paths can kind of become a cage sometimes. And, We sit there and say, oh, this is what my ancestors did. This is what they have always done. This is what's been passed down. This is what it's taught me. This is just what we do. This is why we do it. And then when you usually ask those questions of like why, you're kind of stuck with that. Well, that's just because that's the way it is. And then you're like, oh, okay, oh, okay. Like you end up asking so many questions. Well, why? Oh, this doesn't make sense. Can you explain it to me? And they don't have the answers. Could cause stagnation. Could make you kind of feel like in a cage, confusion. But is it producing spiritual transformation in you? Like, is what your ancestors did making a spiritual transformation in you? Sometimes it might be. But overall, if we're looking at a legit, full on spiritual system that creates transformation, well, we want to make sure that it's developing awareness. We want to make sure it's developing discipline, compassion, courage and strength at the same time. I think discernment is huge. So you can discern right from wrong, truth from fiction, etc. It should help within adab, character building, and humility. Your spiritual intelligence and your intellect should go higher. The knowledge of yourself should expand. And no matter what, it shouldn't really leave you without that relationship with the divine. Because if it leaves you without the relationship with the divine, you're missing a point. You're missing a tiny little point, and it's not that it's wrong. It's just it's not fully connected in a way. So if we spend years defending a tradition and nothing but fear, anger, this like rigidity, judgment, stagnation within life, and just spiritual progress altogether, well, then you should examine it. You know, so we must make the point that the problem isn't necessarily the tradition. The problem may actually be the relationship between the person and the tradition. And that's where the little nuances are. Because maybe in the past life, you didn't have a good relationship with Christians. And now you're a Christian. And now you don't like it. Even though you've been in it all your life. And you're like, man, my soul's not wanting to do this. There could be so many variables. I've met Hindus that were like, I've been in Hinduism my whole life. And now I'm actually a Sufi Muslim. Sweet. It's actually not that different. A little different, but it's not that different. So the ancestral path is that cage. It can put you in a cage. So what do I mean by like what is a soul path though? And we have to define the other side. Well, a soul path is something that is a spiritual direction that produces a deeper resonance within the soul, which actually creates development, not stagnation. It creates development. You're always developing and going higher and higher and higher, like a cyclical spiral going upwards. So it doesn't always have to feel comfortable. Usually when people switch and they go to their soul path, it's never comfortable. In fact, it's usually highly uncomfortable because it's new. This is where the home is changed in a way. So one thing you can always say to yourself, your soul's home isn't necessarily the place where you would feel the most comfortable. It's actually where your soul's home is the most capable of becoming. And your soul path may challenge you. That's what it's for. You can't get growth without challenge. You can't get growth without looking at yourself and seeing those challenges. So the proper path is always going to challenge you. We must be comfortable with like confronting ourselves. You have to be comfortable with abandoning an old like ideologies, identities, and aspects of yourself that were there before. You have to end up abandoning them. And that's scary to a lot of people because then they're like, who am I? What's going on? It's uncomfortable learning unfamiliar teachings. Might be confusing. Entering the spiritual environments, say you've never been in a mosque before. Well, it might be a shock. Say you've never been in a church cathedral before. That could be a shock too. It's beautiful, but it could be a shock. Say you've entered an occult ritual. That could be a shock. So, you have to question your assumptions and you're, developing disciplines that you've really never encountered before. It's totally new. It makes you confront your ego in a different way. And it makes you become a little bit more responsible for your spiritual development because now you're actually asking the right questions. You're following something that's not outside of you. You're actually following something inside of you, which is your soul, being like, hey, no, we got to do this. We got to go this way. Do this. And that's okay. So sometimes, it feels like most foreign thing actually starts becoming familiar, where it's like, wow, that does feel nice. That does feel natural. I'm confused, but I'm willing to give it a try, and that's the big part. Like, if you feel pulled, definitely give it a try because don't feel caged ever. And when you follow a soul path, you should constantly feel yourself progressing. Sure, you're going to hit some little roadblocks, but if you can't get over those roadblocks, well, then that path ain't something. If it keeps happening over and over again, well, let's look at it again. So you don't want to say, oh, just do whatever feels good. It's not about feeling good, and it's too simplistic. It's like, oh, I like doing this because it makes me feel good. Yeah, but then we have to see where that feel good is, because a lot of things that people do bad for them, it actually makes them feel good. So, look at people that have, um, drug addictions. It might be bad for them, but it's making them feel good. It's no different with spirituality because sometimes spirituality is like a band-aid, a mask over something that's even deeper. So we have to sit there and say, does this path like produce things of me becoming something? Am I becoming more conscious? Am I becoming more disciplined? Am I being honest with myself? Am I being honest with others? Am I capable of handling suffering? Does more spiritually discerning things bother me? Does the fear of less controlled of fear and ego bother you? All these things that we have to look at. We have to look at, do we feel more connected? Do we feel like we're connected to the divine? Are we more capable of serving others? Because a genuine soul path really should, eventually leave evidence of how it's working, how it's progressing you, how it's changing you. So it's not necessarily like worldly success. It's inner development, always. And, we can't emphasize enough that comfort is not really a measurement. Transformation is that measurement. Like, wow, changing is really uncomfortable, but now, bam, here's our measurement of this is where it is. That's amazing. And that's where transformation is not just spinning around a cycle, but we're going around and then we come up. Oh, come up. We're progressing. We're forever spiraling upwards. The ancestral path and the soul path can become one. It's not about them really being separate. I feel that the soul path is more just based on that pull, that energetic pull to be more and have more that you are stuck in. And that's a pretty common thing, especially in the occult. People, they'll practice one form of system for a while, and it's just like, I feel like I've, burnt it out, and I'll move to another one. And they'll burn that one out, and then they'll move to another one, another one, another one, another one. That could actually get dangerous, because you're mixing all these different type of spiritual influences. But at the same time, you kind of find your way through it. So, the ultimate goal doesn't have to be choosing between ancestry and the soul path, because oftentimes not. The ancestral path is your soul path. That is a thing. But what about those people that is like, all these traditions and all these inheriting of ideas and ideologies and these the belief system? It's not feeding the soul, right? It's not feeding the soul. So sometimes you got to leave it. Sometimes you got to come back to it. Or sometimes you don't have to leave it at all, but just expand your horizons. Okay, like I'm a Muslim, but I'm not. I try not to be strict. I used to be. I know I have got those moments before, and it's a religion that it can come from, and it's something that I've battled in myself and like, don't be strict. And when I find myself not being strict about it, oh my God, it's so much funner. It's so much better. I'm happier. I'm less judgmental to things. I see everything as God. I see a blade of grass as God. Doesn't mean I'm going to worship it, but I'm looking at the blade of grass as God. The camera I'm looking at right now for you guys, I look at that as a piece of God. And that's kind of the beauty of it. So you can expand, but still hold the line. So that's something to think about. Because sometimes you return to it later with a completely different lens, a complete different eyes. And sometimes you discover what you thought was, cultural inheritance was actually just, crap. It was just pushed upon you. And actually, the truth of it, your soul recognizes. And sometimes your soul path takes you outside your ancestral tradition, and that's okay, because all of them kind of lead back to one. If we're talking about the law of one and one singularity of or this one thing is, even though it's infinite, even though there's so much multi-dimensionality in it, well, I mean, that's pretty infinite. So we have to understand that ancestry is just a doorway. It's not a prison. So you don't have to feel stuck in, oh, this is just what it is, because it's never the case. So we have to look at it as a bigger esoteric perspective. You know, we have to bring all these systems together. And if consciousness is larger than one lifetime, well, then perhaps spiritual identity is also larger than one cultural system or identity too. You know, perhaps we are asking the wrong questions when we ask, like, what religion am I supposed to follow? When really we should be asking, like, what path is actually there to transform me the most? Which one of all these hundreds of different paths transform me the most? What is transforming my consciousness? Not just my life, but my consciousness. You know, there are teachings that just can be unhealthy. I've never seen somebody like in super, crazy stuff end up having good stuff. And sometimes, even good teachings can lead to really bad things. And things like cults start. Where that's just being unhealthy anyway. And then people that are manipulated into these things. And, there are traditions that can be misused. I mean, that's a whole different video on itself. And the soul path isn't like I'm going to do whatever I want. That's not what that is at all. It's actually more based on like what actually transforms me. And that's crucial to have that distinction for sure. Your ancestors gave you a beginning. They gave you a body, a culture, a language, history, perhaps even a spiritual tradition. Honor it. Learn from it. Move from it if you have to. But don't confuse inheritance with like your actual soul's destiny of what you're supposed to be doing, because it's highly limiting. You're putting yourself in a cage. A bird has to fly. You can't keep a crow in a cage. You can't keep a raven in a cage. You can't keep an owl in a cage. Your soul probably more than likely has a much older story than you even realize. And it's much bigger than your family tree. Because think about the families that you're a part of maybe in those other lifetimes. So big. So the path that really belongs to you, belongs to your soul. And it's not always the path that makes you the most comfortable. It's going to challenge you, it's going to break identities, and it may force you to grow. But that's kind of what we're here for. All of us are here to grow and become better so we can build a new earth, a new paradigm of greatness. So ask yourself this, am I following a path because it was given to me, like handed to me, programmed into me, or because through walking it I've realized that I'm becoming more than what this was meant for me to be? And that's the biggest thing we can do when we're picking what's best for our biggest development. I hope this video helped you guys today. Until next time, take care.